Good evening, everyone. My name is Grace Hayek, and on behalf of the Glencoe Public Library, I welcome you to our webinar with Professor Wendy Doniger, who joins us from Cape Cod.
Hello.
Tonight's program is sponsored by the Friends of the Glencoe Public Library, which has supported so many interesting programs and events for the benefit of library patrons. And now I'd like to introduce our presenter tonight. Dr. Wendy Doniger earned 2 doctorates, one in Sanskrit and Indian Studies from Harvard and one in Oriental Studies from Oxford, on her way to becoming a full professor in the Divinity School at the University of Chicago from 1978 to 2018. She is the author of many translations of Sanskrit texts, as well as books about Hindu mythology and cross-cultural mythology, particularly about illusions, animals, gender, and sex. She has published 2 more books already just this year. One is called After the War, the Last Books of the Mahabharata, and the other, An American Girl in India, Letters from 1963 to 1964. Professor Doniger, we're so glad you can be with us here tonight, and I'll let you take it from here.
Thank you for inviting me, and I look forward to having some discussion after I give the talk. There might be some participation by my dog, but I hope not. So I want to talk about sex and jewelry, and I want to begin with what I call the slut assumption. Starting from the simple observation that jewelry has been the only form of wealth that women have been allowed to own throughout most of history and most of the world, I decided to look at stories that men and women have told about women and their jewelry. The patterns that link jewelry and the sexuality of women have intricate historical and sociological implications, but a ruthless structuralist can group the narratives of circular jewelry into 2 contrasting paradigms. Though they're ancient types, I've named them after the 2 film icons who seared my soul when I was a teenager in the 1950s, Doris Day from 1924 and Marilyn Monroe from 1926. The Doris Day professional virgin scenario of legitimation, get the wedding ring before you go to bed with him, is challenged by the Marilyn Monroe gold digger scenario of illegitimation, get lots of rings or bracelets or necklaces before and after you go to bed with him. These 2 paradigms have different historical trajectories, one from the regulation of marriage by religion, and the other from the survival strategies of women outside the confines of religion. The tension between them is the driving force behind the narratives. But both of them are grounded in what I would call the slut assumption. When a woman has a piece of jewelry, she must have gotten it by sleeping with some man, her husband if she is a good girl, or a lover if she is unmarried and not a good girl. This is a variant on the theme that has now become an important part of our Me Too and woke culture, the well-known fact that economically dominant men often demand sexual favors from women in return for money, jobs, or other forms of economic reward, including jewelry. By surveying a large range of stories, I can show how deeply embedded the slut assumption is, even in the minds of people who know it is counterfactual. So let's begin with the rehabilitation of cads. In many of the stories about rings, the narrator is caught on the horns of a dilemma. In many versions of the story, and of course in real life, always the ultimate source of our stories, a man seduces and abandons a woman, denying that he is the father of her child. In the stories, eventually she finds a way to prove either the seduction or the paternity, often using a ring for her evidence. And the man is forced to acknowledge the legitimacy of the child, though he has behaved caddishly in lying about his connection with her. But in some cases, notably in ancient India and medieval Germany, 2 cultures that I happen to have studied, the cad who seduces and abandons his rightful wife becomes an important political figure, a national hero, or the founder of a political dynasty. And at that point, the ring serves a very different purpose. The narrator makes it into a magic ring of forgetfulness and tells the story so that the cad is no longer a cad, but a fine fellow whose memory was, through no fault of his own, magically erased so that he did not knowingly abandon his true love. This happened to the father of King Bharata in ancient India, when he becomes a king after whom India is actually named, the Mahabharata, in most North Indian languages. They have a very important king in Indian history. And it happened to Siegfried, who conveniently forgot Brunhilde when he met a girl with better political connections. The narrators of the medieval stories of Siegfried were hard-pressed to rehabilitate a cad en route to becoming an ethnic hero. In such revisions, someone has to take the rap, and the ring of forgetfulness is the fall guy. The ring offers a socially acceptable reason for doing what you secretly want to do. The ring expresses long before Freud repressed and ambivalent feelings. It gives the hero permission to violate the promise of monogamy that the ring also represents. The ring says, I love only you, but it also says, it is not my fault if I forget that I promised to love only you. The ring of forgetfulness justifies the violation not only of monogamy, but of adulterous relationships. The hero is not even true to the woman with whom he is betraying his wife. Tristan, in some of the medieval texts, betrays two queens, both conveniently but confusingly named Isolde. And he comes to his senses only when the magic ring slips off his finger. It's not just a matter of a European courtly ethic, using the ring as an alibi required by a newly arrived high Christian ethic. It happens in ancient India too, where the ring justifies polygamy in a polygamous society where it should need no justification. The ring is folklore's drug of choice. Forget me not, inscribed on so many rings, asks the lover not to forget the first intensity of feeling for the beloved. And why indeed should it be necessary to foresee and forestall in advance that forgetfulness might be a problem against which it is best to take precautions from the very start? The ring of memory is intended to ward against the mundane, gradual erosion of love. The myth transmutes this gradual process into the sudden amnesia produced by the negative magic of the ring of forgetfulness. As time passed, new techniques of magical amnesia were invoked, though they were still used in the service of the same goals. Why are there so many stories about men who forget their women, and relatively few stories about women who forget their men? Or to put it differently, why do more cultures permit polygyny than polyandry? Some scholars would explain the gender imbalance in terms of biology, different roles that men and women play in producing a child. Others in terms of culture, the different roles that men and women play in society. Our stories cannot settle this question, but they can furnish stunning evidence of the length and breadth of this inequality in the records of human history. As men use rings to wiggle out of tight spots, women can use rings in their counter subterfuges. In many of the stories of forgetful husbands, the ring eventually cures the man's forgetfulness, though it also justifies it as well. In a widespread tale known to folklorists as the clever wife or the clever wench, a husband challenges his wife to get a child, almost always a son, fathered by him, though he refuses to sleep with her. Usually he challenges her to get his ring, which he will never take off. She succeeds by disguising herself as another woman, usually a foreign woman or a woman of low class, and tricking him into bed. This maneuver is known as a bed trick. Sometimes he doesn't mention the ring, but she insists on having it before she submits to him, so that later she can prove that she was the woman in his bed, or he in hers, depending on your point of view, and therefore that the child is his. It is this therefore that requires some further discussion. This myth has a very long shelf life indeed. It underlies the story of Tamar and Judah in the Hebrew Bible, and the story of Helena and Bertram in Shakespeare's All's Well That Ends Well, and a number of other stories throughout the Indo-European and Semitic worlds. As it travels through Europe, Asia, and the Middle East, numerous variations develop. Two different female virtues are at stake. On the one hand, the subversive virtue of actively resisting, fighting for what you want, honestly or dishonestly. And on the other hand, the noble passive virtue of being innocent of sin. The clever wife is spurned for her wit at the start of the story, but she's praised for it at the end. Defending her marital fidelity with a subversive intelligence, she proves that she is sinless as well as clever. The clever wife gets the child, but is that the happy ending? Does she really get what she wants? I wonder. The usual legal process is for a woman to get a ring and then get a baby. The usual physical process is first sex, then baby. To have the baby but not the ring is, of course, the defining situation of every unwed mother, the fate worse than death that haunted all those Doris Day films. The narrative paradox of the clever wife reverses this process, requiring the woman to have a baby and a ring in order to get the sex. Of course, here too, the sex must come first. It merely appears to come second. In these stories about the tension between illicit eroticism on the one hand and legal marriage and progeny on the other, circular jewelry expresses the circular paradox of marital sexual rejection. The husband desires both an erotic encounter and a legitimate child, but not always from the same woman. To close the circle, his wife must circle back to become the person she knows she is, the person he cannot see until she transforms herself there and back again, namely his erotic partner. And indeed, it may well be that he does know subconsciously that this other woman is in fact his own wife, so that he satisfies both of his desires at the same time. Often the upper-class wife attempts to overcome her husband's paralyzing respect through a change in class. She dresses like a whore, or a change in culture. She dresses like a foreigner. Doris Day pretends to be Marilyn Monroe or Marlene Dietrich. The clever wife is usually foreign, not merely in the explicit political sense. She may wear the costume of another culture. Shakespeare's Helena goes from Paris to Florence, but in the psychological sense of alienation or defamiliarization, she makes herself strange to her husband and hence desirable, no longer the boring legitimate partner, but fresh again. The fantasy of wife as mistress, in which the housewife dresses up for her husband in a sexy negligee, underlies this sort of story. But when the wife rather than the mistress is of a lower class, that too can be the reason for her rejection. Too high or too low, too clever or well-connected, or simply not his own free choice, she seems to begin in a no-win situation. Her only way out is to escape from all of these superficial labels and turn her cleverness from a liability into an asset. Becoming someone else, she makes him see who she really is. And by getting his ring, she proves it. The stories pit men's power against women's cleverness. No matter who actually sets the terms of the test, he always has the power and he always leaves her, but she is always clever enough to trick him into coming back. In other stories too, a ring can be swallowed by a fish and discovered when the fish is caught and served at table. or the ring is otherwise lost and miraculously rediscovered. But some way or other, the ring establishes the true paternity of the wished-for son. These stories, however counterfactual they may appear, are a response to a very basic biological fact, far more basic than the problem of class or sexual psychology. The driving force behind the paranoia of paternal insecurity is well captured by the Latin legal phrase, pater incertus, the father is uncertain, or the variant, pater semper incertus, the father is always uncertain, often coupled with the phrase, mater semper certa est, the mother is always certain. It's usually interpreted to mean that the father is uncertain in the sense of unknowable, impossible to ascertain, but it also has the overtones of uncertain in the sense of nervous, full of doubt, a meaning highly relevant to our corpus of narratives. In our day, it is nicely translated by the South Chicago saying, mama's baby, papa's maybe. The stories of clever wives pit male fears about legitimacy, about corrupted paternity, against women's knowledge about sexuality. And the ring is the physical evidence, more certain than the hoped for resemblance between the infant and the husband, that the child is in fact his father's son. I want to move from these old stories to the modern period and talk about De Beers and the modern myth of the diamond ring. The idea that the gift of a ring is proof of everlasting love continues to exert a mythological power even in our day. By drawing upon this mythology, the De Beers Diamond Company was able to invent in 1939 and successfully spread a brand new myth that a woman whose fiancé truly loved her had to have a diamond engagement ring, and that this had always been so. But in fact, only a very few wealthy people had ever been able to afford diamonds, all from Golconda in India, before the discovery of the South African mines at the end of the 19th century. Here is another form of evidence that great myths have the power to perpetuate ideas, including destructive ideas, even in people who know that they are not true. The diamond engagement ring is the epitome of bling. The bling ring is at the heart of De Beers Consolidated Mines Limited, which has since the 19th century dominated and controlled the diamond industry, both mining and training, operating mines of all kinds, open pit, underground, alluvial, coastal, deep sea, all over the world. For in the 20th century, De Beers invented a new mythology of the engagement ring, the success of which allowed them to elevate the price of diamonds to a dizzying height that amounts to highway robbery. That this new myth, that a diamond ring was an essential part of an engagement, took off as it did, was due in large part to the momentum it stole from the pervasive mythology that connects all rings with sex and/or love. Myths generally look back to a blurry, unknowable past, but from time to time you can see a myth taking shape right before your eyes. Such is the case of the myth that you have to have a diamond ring when you become engaged to be married, a dogma that has been called an urgent mythology. Many people take it for granted now, but it is really a most peculiar idea. The villagers who worked in the diamond mines in Africa, when asked if they knew how their diamonds would eventually be used when they left Africa, answered no, they had no idea. When told that in America, it's traditional for a man to give a woman a diamond when he asks her to marry him, this set off a round of laughter. They'd never heard of such a thing. It was ridiculous to think of. The essential diamond engagement ring is a new myth. But new myths always ride piggyback on old myths, and the engagement ring myth draws upon the more general mythology of jewelry that have buoyed up stories such as the tale of the clever wife for many centuries. In the first advertisements for diamond engagement rings, there's not a hint of anything being cutting edge or trendy or modern. There was instead an overt expectation that the reader was, of course, going to play the game, just as his ancestors had, even though they hadn't. Not only were De Beers able to impress upon the average woman and men, especially the men, that diamonds were now an imperative for marriage, they were able to make it seem as though it had always been that way. That is the job description of a myth, as my old colleague Mircea Eliade pointed out long ago. The myth that happens now must make us believe that it has happened already in that ancient time, in illo tempore. And so De Beers didn't have to invent the myth from scratch. They could hitch their wagon to the old stories about women and their jewelry. Moreover, diamonds, being devoid of any particular shape or color, can fit into anyone's myth. They are, as one critic put it, nothing more than an empty cage for our dreams. De Beers added to the inherited mythology of the Ring of Love the simple codicil that it had to have a diamond. But that writer trailed a long narrative train, where diamonds have a mythology of their own beyond their place in the more general mythology of jewelry. Everyone knows that diamonds are hard, therefore indestructible and permanent. Or are they? In the hands of De Beers, the meaning of the hardness of diamonds underwent a significant change to stand for the hoped-for durability and permanence of marriage. Unlike flesh and memory, and above all, unlike love, diamonds do not seem to be subject to time. In the 20th century, ads proclaimed, "May your marriage last as long as your diamond." But the durability of diamonds was also contrasted with the transience of the human body, and perhaps the transience of the sort of love inspired by the body. The lyricist Leo Robin, who happened to have been my uncle, it's a long story, wrote Gentlemen Prefer Blondes. And he contrasted the changeless qualities of diamonds with the inevitable changes that would overcome the women who wore them. Men grow cold as girls grow old, and we all lose our charms in the end. But square cut or pear shape, these rocks don't lose their shape. And then time rolls on and youth is gone, and you can't straighten up when you bend, but stiff back or stiff knees, you stand straight at Tiffany's. Diamonds are a girl's best friend. Diamonds outlive youth, outlast a human lifetime, and by implication, outlast love. And so diamonds are a girl's best friend. But nothing is unchanging, not even diamonds, not even love. There's an old German legend about a magic ring set with a diamond. Should a woman wearing this ring prove unfaithful in love, the gold turned to dross and the diamond became glass. In other stories, a ring may break in two, or the color of the stone may change if the giver proves untrue. And indeed, diamonds, though hard, are not indestructible. They're very brittle, more brittle than jade, easy to crack with a moderate tap of a hammer. Diamonds burn too if the flame is hot enough. Diamonds are not permanent after all. Besides, even the big ones are pretty small compared with, say, a Porsche or even a pearl necklace. You can as easily lose a diamond ring as any other ring, and it's more likely to be stolen. So much for hardness, indestructibility, and permanence. De Beers also sent another message loud and clear to men. Diamonds will help you seduce. Sexy diamonds, ads bragged or warned that her bliss and his worth as a man are dependent on his ability to whip out the stone. Whip out is a particularly neat bit of suggestion, I think, but the mythology of diamonds generally assimilated them to the women whose best friends they were, rather than to their lovers. Some 21st century women rebelled against the De Beers mythology and moved to free themselves from the power that men have exerted over them through jewelry. They rebel in various ways, not only by A, selling their diamond rings, but by B, buying their own diamond jewelry, or C, buying themselves something other than diamonds, or D, buying costume jewelry instead of the real thing, or E, forswearing jewelry altogether, or for many women, F, never giving a damn for jewelry in the first place. Only option B, buying their own diamond jewelry, still plays into De Beers' hands, but it too can serve feminist ends. Many women, as the movement for women to buy their own jewelry gained momentum, De Beers tried to sleep with the enemy by advertising in 2012 a ring, generally featuring stones of less than 2 carats, that women were encouraged to buy for themselves. The implicit message of these ads is that women don't necessarily need a man to buy them diamonds, and that female empowerment is only one purchase away. An ad in Vanity Fair aimed at married women declared, "Your left hand celebrates the day you were married. Your right hand," on which women were encouraged to wear the diamond they themselves bought, "celebrates the day you were born." Another ad cut to the chase. "Your left hand says we, your right hand says me." But many women are raising their left hands without diamonds on them. Diamonds are, as one critic archly remarked, a cartel's best friend. Sean Connery, as James Bond in the film Diamonds Are Forever, mused, "I suppose they've replaced dogs as a girl's best friend. Diamonds may once have been a girl's best friend, but they are no longer always a woman's best friend." What is the conceptual thread on which we can string these gems of stories? There are several, of course, but one very basic one is the eternal triangle of jewelry, sex, and money. Many of the stories about magic rings are about the interaction between jewelry and, on the one hand, sex and gender, or if you prefer, sex and women, and on the other hand, money and power. These stories remind us of why the word luxury means lust and lasciviousness before it came to mean opulence and extravagance, and why luxury, usefully compressing together opulence and libido, is the patron goddess of jewelry, giving a double meaning to the phrase, the lap of luxury. There's a lot of talk about love in these tales, but they're really all about lucre, about payment for services rendered. They are not true love stories. The clever wives are not primarily after love. They're trying to secure their son's inheritance. And although it's not at all clear what different cultures mean by love, they seem generally to agree on the meanings of sex and money. Men, male jewelers, male buyers, exchange jewelry in much the same way that, as Claude Lévi-Strauss taught us to see, men exchange women to cement alliances between men. Fathers give their daughters away to sons-in-law in marriage ceremonies, often in exchange for a bride price, the reverse of a dowry. And men who have controlled both the production and the sale of jewelry have also generated much of its mythology. We've seen how the mythology created by the De Beers Corporation in Amsterdam bamboozled several generations of Americans into buying diamond rings they could not afford. The woman herself often became the most visible of a man's worldly goods, and if he went one step further and draped her with precious jewels, she herself, as the jewel in the crown of his possessions, became an even more vivid display of his personal wealth. We speak nowadays of a trophy wife, a young, very pretty wife of a much older, very rich man. But the metaphor can work in both directions. If she is what used to be called a gold digger, then he is her trophy, as well as her bankroll. As the histories of these stories testify, for many centuries in many parts of the world, jewelry has been the only property that most women have been allowed to own. Jewelry gives a woman a degree of financial and political independence. She has nothing but the jewels she stands up in, a catty woman remarks in a book by Somerset Maugham. Jewelry was for women what James C. Scott has taught us to call a weapon of the weak. Often women's jewelry was all they could use to defend themselves against men who denied them the ownership of land and permanent property. Jewelry has all the advantages of what Wemmick in Charles Dickens' Great Expectations called portable property. Jewelry is both portable and fungible. It has often been all that a woman could take with her if she was divorced or if she divorced her husband. It's the key to her freedom. Until quite recently, if a woman wanted to leave her husband, few legal or economic sanctions were available to her, but she was usually allowed to keep the jewelry she had brought into the marriage as part of her dowry, and sometimes also the jewelry that she had been given by her husband. And this brought her some degree of independence. In early America, the jewelry a woman had been given was the last asset that the probate officers could touch, the last asset vulnerable to being seized as payment for her late husband's debts. Outside the law, too, a woman in desperation could simply take her jewelry and run off into the night, taking her chances. Let me shift our focus now from the social context of the jewelry myths to the texts that arise from that context, the place that the stories are told. Many of these tales were borrowed by one culture from another or diffused from a common source. But the very fact that these stories and not others were able to travel like certain wines and to be told again and again in such different contexts indicates that they are, in a very real sense, at home in several different cultures, however much they may be differently inflected and take on different meanings in each new context. Why do so many people tell these same stories again and again? Why do these myths structure and have such a stranglehold on the human imagination? More particularly, why do people keep telling stories that fly so blatantly in the face of logic and reason, even when logical concerns are explicitly raised in the course of the stories themselves? A myth can be defined as a story believed by many people over a long period, despite persistent evidence that it is not factually true. Mythic narratives survive because, while a basic plot may remain intact, the point of the plot, even its moral and its relationship to forms of skepticism, reason, or cultural constructions of common sense, may be changed, even reversed, to suit the changing assumptions of different times and different places. Myths endure precisely because people keep changing them into something that serves their present needs. Most of these stories appear in texts that were written by men, but women are storytellers too. Even texts that male scribes recorded often tell stories that they heard from mothers or nurses, the sources of so many old wives' tales. But though we can occasionally note a different tone in stories whose tellers have been identified as female, by and large, the same sexist cultural rationale pervades the culture of both men and women, and consciously or unconsciously constrains the stories of narrators of both genders. Why do men tell these stories when they show men up to be such cads? Because they reflect the rationality of their time and place in which such behavior was considered normal or macho or virile or honorable or what you will. And because the old myths live on, often patch up a bit even when new ethical norms make them an embarrassment. And because there's something in the stories that reassures men about things that are important to them, such as the paternity of their children. Such stories often encode repressive social agendas. The tales of clever wives enforce the view that it is the job of women to remain faithful to their husbands, no matter how badly, how unreasonably they are treated. And they let men off the hook by pretending to redress the balance of power, as if to say, I'm not a bully, she can defend herself by her wiles. On the other hand, we may ask why women tell stories that depict them as promiscuous tricksters. Perhaps because they're also depicted as cleverer than the men and usually only apparently promiscuous. It might also be argued that it is in the interest of women to see men depicted as cads, and in the interest of men to see women depicted as promiscuous tricksters. Viewed that way, it's a win-win situation. The connection between jewelry, women, and deception is an enduring one. Our stories accuse jewelry and women of faking it in various ways. Fake jewelry is mirrored in the deceptions, the lies, for women pretending to be other women. But considerations of the changing social context of these stories shift our focus back to the outer level of the narrative frame, where the narrator uses the ring to obscure the fact that the men were faking it when they said they had not slept with the women, or that they had forgotten that they had slept with the women. The cross-cultural corpus of stories about fake jewelry reveals how male narrators fake it with the audience's collusion, how they cast moral aspersions on one of the few sources of women's independence, their jewelry, how they maintain the illusion that if you can get someone's ring, you can prove that he slept with you, or that he did not really abandon you, but was merely helplessly bewitched into temporarily forgetting you, or that if you can prove that a woman has real jewelry that her husband did not give her, you can prove that she was unfaithful to him. The gender myths mesh nicely. The slut assumption, if the woman has the ring, she slept with some guy, balances the paternity fear. If she has your ring, you must be the father of her kid. Here is where the cross-cultural distribution of this theme is so impressive. It shows us how often narrators have tricked their audiences into believing what they so deeply want to believe, that a little thing like a ring can bring justice to the asymmetrical power relations that have controlled female sexuality for most of human history. It shows how widespread is the desire to project the responsibility for sexual rejection or betrayal onto an external force like a gold ring. I think I'll stop here. I had some other thoughts about the nature of mythology, but let's see whether you have questions about what I've said so far.
Wow, you made me laugh out loud. You made me rethink my jewelry box. I don't think I'll ever look at a diamond ring in the same way.
Oh, sorry. Absolutely.
Thank you very much for that. For a couple of phrases that I'm always going to retain, like rehabilitation of cads.
Oh, yeah. Sorry about the barking. There wasn't a lot of barking, but I did the best I could.
No, there wasn't. For those of you who are watching, Dr. Doniger has a really cute dog who thinks that the coyotes are going to break into the house. And
that he can stop them.
Right. Okay, we have a couple of questions. I wanted to ask you, how prevalent are rings as a symbol of commitment in cultures around the world? I mean, does every culture use rings to express meaning, or
I don't think
every single one of them?
Not
something
every
round finger means something everywhere?
Not every culture. Nothing. Okay. There's nothing that every culture does.
Okay.
Rings are important because unlike earrings or necklaces or bracelets, they become part of your body. Often if you get a ring when you're young, you can't get it off after a while as your fingers grow bigger and so forth. Most people don't take their rings off at night, whereas you always take off your earrings and your necklace and so forth and your anklets. So they are more like a part of the body than any other form of jewelry. And so I think that's it. There's also the sexual symbolism of putting a ring on a finger. So I think those two factors tend to make many cultures, not all, many cultures, tell stories about rings that involve sexual fidelity of one kind or another, or simply to use rings as tokens of love.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Marilyn writes, wonderful song, wonderfully sung. That was really fun. And she says she's talking about the British crown, the big Indian diamond on the crown.
Oh, yes.
Do you know anything about that one, and should it be returned? there's some controversy about that, I guess.
Oh, yes. Well, as I said, until the late 19th century, all the diamonds came from India. And the diamonds that were taken from India, it's interesting. We now think that we've sort of invented the idea of cultural guilt. At last, people say the British should give back the Elgin marbles, and the University of Chicago should give back all the stuff it took from Egypt and all of that. But there are stories right in the 18th and 19th century about dangerous diamonds, cursed diamonds. Wilkie Collins wrote a whole book about it. They come in and out of many, many different stories. So there's a kind of cultural guilt about taking those great diamonds out of India. There's Agatha Christie stories about them. It goes on for several centuries during the British Empire that we love to have these wonderful diamonds, but they bring death. They bring this and so forth. So I think those stories of devastating cursed diamonds, the idol's eye, the diamond that was taken from a statue of Shiva or taken from a statue of Vishnu, that's in the Wilkie Collins story. Those stories represent the fact that there was a feeling, even then, that we did something bad to those people when we took away all this stuff from them. And we have a different kind of a sensibility now in the 21st century, and there's the beginning of talk about giving some of them back. But where would you start and where would you end? I mean, the British took everything from India. You'd have to give back all of Britain if you want to give back what they took from India. Why just the diamonds, which after all aren't worth anything? Why start with that? Why not give back the cloth that they stole from the Indian weavers? I mean, there's just so much that they took that I think it's interesting that people focus on the diamonds because diamonds are so dramatic and they cost so much money and all that. But there has been an irrational focus on the dangerous diamond, which I think reflects several centuries of cultural guilt, which is stupid because the British did many more terrible things to India than take away some diamonds.
True that. What you said about the De Beers diamond myth was fascinating. It made me wonder what stone, if any, was commonly used before that, and that's my question.
Yeah. Well, pearls were always valued. The pearl fishers, bises, the pearl fishers, rubies and emeralds, the colored stones, the beauty of sapphires and rubies. Gemstones have always been relatively rare. Turquoise is less valuable; it's more common and so forth. Amber, the Russians have always loved what they call yantar, amber, which is not even a gemstone at all, really. It's a sort of a chemical that happens. I don't know where amber comes from, but there are different cultures valued different rings, different stones, and indeed most of them prefer stones that have color and not diamonds. And in any case, nobody had diamonds for a long time, except a few very rich people. Kings and queens always had diamonds, but other people just had gold rings usually. And there's also the metaphor of gold, of purifying gold. You put it in the fire, all the impurities come out. So you end up with something pure, and that's a symbol of a pure love. So gold was a very good symbol of love, and gold rings. Or everyone who could get gold all over the world, it seems to me, gave gold rings as love rings and so forth.
Right. And you were talking. This talk was about the intersection of jewelry and sex, but of course, rings have been used in history to express power, to convey authority, to be used for many other symbolic reasons also.
Oh, yeah. For identity, the king's ring. If you show them this ring, he'll know it's from me, and so forth. The Pope's ring, indeed, male power.
Which you must kiss, right?
You must indeed.
Lauren says, decades ago, before she was married, she was involved in a market research study for what she assumed was De Beers when they were trying to find out the "don't wait for a man, you deserve to buy diamonds for yourself" one. Yeah, they studied that.
I don't know how successful it was. I don't know a lot of women that buy their own jewelry. You either get it from your mom or you don't have it. But that's the crowd I run with. It may be that people who are not academics do in fact buy their own jewelry. I don't know.
If anyone else has a question, this is a great time to ask it. Going once, going twice.
I could say some more about myths, the part that I left out.
Oh, love to hear it.
So I could talk a little bit about the irrationality of myths in general, which explains why these unreasonable stories, like for instance, you lose your ring and it's found in a fish and the fish is brought to your table. That story is so popular. Why that? I could talk a little bit about that. Should I say a little more about that?
Yes, please.
All right. Okay. I'll also introduce my companion here because he's made such a fuss. So I think come on.
Can't quite see him. Oh. Huh.
There he is. There he is. All right, now maybe he'll be quiet for a little while. Knowing that the stories about diamonds are myths makes it easier to understand why no one objects to the violation of reason, either in hearing the stories or in deciding to spend $10,000 on a diamond engagement ring instead of a down payment on a condo. The diamond myth lives in a world a bit outside of logic. Myths disdain reason almost by definition, at least by my partial definition of a myth, as a narrative capable of ignoring evidence. Myths as a whole are unreasonable, not merely from the standpoint of Enlightenment types standing outside the culture, but even for the people who make the myths, people who are perfectly capable of noticing that human beings cannot fly and who can also see the logical flaws in the use of a ring as a proof text. Such stories demand that the reader or listener suspend the sense not only of what is physically possible, but what is logical, overlooking easily available explanations for certain events in favor of the extremely unlikely explanation that the traditional story offers. Many of the rings in the mythology of sex and jewelry are signet rings, with the bearer's name or emblem on it. The signet ring is the only kind of ring that is a certain sign of identity. But even the signet ring is not proof of what the bearer had done. Someone else might have stolen it, sold it, and so forth, and worn it to commit the act in question, or indeed not to commit the act in question. That such arguments from reason were always available to storytellers and audiences is easily demonstrated by a number of stories in which someone does question how, after all, a ring can prove that someone did or did not commit an act of sexual infidelity. Reason often pipes up to argue against the proof. Reason says, look for the ring where you lost it. Reason says, lots of people have rings like that, or you stole the ring, or that's not my ring. In other words, the ring lies. But these narratives work on us at a very deep level in a way that is hard to resist. The myth persists because of its intrinsic value for the individual, over and above its value for the rationale of the culture. Freud's concept of denial shows us some of the factors that often trump reason. People see not only what fits with the view of the world that supports their lives, but also what they want to see for their personal emotional needs. The belief that love will last forever and that your special ring is proof of this is spectacularly counterfactual, but not counterintuitive. It is entirely intuitive. It is what we want to believe. It is what our deepest intuitions grab hold of instead of reason, and is what the mythology feeds on. Romantic infatuation comes up against hard facts, legal challenges, and scientific proofs, and it wins with one hand tied behind its back. The mythic ring straddles the line between reason and rationality and confuses the issue, for it is a piece of solid evidence, but it is invoked to support the claims of irrational romanticism. The ring conjures up deep-seated ideas about jewelry and women and desire and deceit that continue to hold us in their thrall, no matter how much we learn that blatantly contradicts our gut feelings or even contradicts the song that our culture is singing at the moment. And so the myth carries the day and the ring rings true. And this is why I think these often stunningly irrational stories are retold all over the world and are being told even today in the age of the internet. So that was my final statement about irrationality.
Thank you. Yeah, we just,
for it.
when it comes down to it, we want to believe.
Yes, it's nice to get a ring. It means he loves me. Well, it doesn't mean he loves you. It means he bought you a ring. But we want to believe, and myths. I mean, the word myth, I use it in the classical sense that Eliade use it as a story that's told by a culture. The word is bandied about now to mean political lies and so forth, but you can use this argument for the political lies too. Why do people believe the insane things that politicians tell them? Because they play on some need that people have to believe things that aren't true.
Are fairy tales also myths? Are they the same thing, do you think?
They are myths in the sense that they're stories that are handed down by cultures. They often have deep meanings. They often carry, they're part of mythology. They're very often counterfactual. People disappear, people turn into animals and so forth. So they are counterfactual stories. They're culturally transmitted. They're shared over a number of cultures. The story of Cinderella, actually a Chinese story that got carried to France. What's the standard of beauty in Cinderella?
I forgot. I'm sorry.
How does he find the one princess he loves?
Oh, right. Shoe
Small
size.
The French don't care about small feet. The Chinese care about small feet. It's a Chinese story. But it got carried into France and made into a different kind of a story and so forth. So myths across cultural lines, and so do fairy tales. They start in one place and they get retold in another place because they're not bound by any particular cultural meaning. Each culture puts what it has into them. The Chinese put into it the small feet. The French put into it the idea of the fragility of glass and so forth. It becomes different in each culture. So yes, the great fairy tales are indeed.
Maybe one of the differences is fairy tales are more considered stories, whereas myths are considered truths. What do you think of that?
Yes, I think people don't really believe that Cinderella lived, but they do believe that Moses lived. Someone once said, a myth is a fairy tale with an army behind it. When you have the power to make people tell certain stories and believe them, you don't call them fairy tales anymore. But the stories that we call fairy tales, children's stories, are actually folk stories that when the Brothers Grimm collected them, that grown-ups were telling. They're not just kids' stories. Some of them are very, very serious. And the Charles Anderson stories are tragic stories. The little girl that freezes to death, the story of the mermaid, those are very tragic stories. So they're not just little things you read to kiddies at night to get them to fall asleep.
I read my daughter The Little Match Girl exactly once, and she sobbed and she said, "Don't ever tell me that story again."
He was absolutely right, and I said the same thing to my parents. It's a terrible story.
Can you tell me how you came to the theme of rings? How you got interested in that as a line of inquiry?
Well, do you know how to make yogurt? If you make real yogurt, you have some yogurt and then you leave some of your old yogurt and you put it into warm milk and it makes more yogurt. And then from that yogurt, you take a little piece of yogurt and you put it into warm milk and you make yogurt. So you seed it. You take a piece out of something and it becomes the beginning of something else. So I've written a lot of books, and very often when I get near the end of a book, I begin to be interested in sub-themes that I haven't got room to really do justice to in the book I'm writing, a kind of spin-off. And I wrote a book, and then I have to write another book about that other book. I wrote a book many years ago called The Bed Trick. about all the stories in which a woman pretends to be another woman in order to get her husband to impregnate her. She gets into his bed under false pretexts. And that was about impersonation and a lot of other things. But I noticed that in a lot of the stories, a ring played a role. And then I thought, this ring is important in this, but rings are also important in other stories that are not bed tricks. And so that became the ring book. But I've also been interested in jewelry. There's a lot of interesting jewelry in my family, rings that my mother had. My grandmother had a hotel in Marienbad where a Russian prince left her a fabulous ring when he couldn't pay his bill, and I have that ring. So there's interesting jewelry in my family and stories about it. So I had a personal investment in certain kinds of meaningful jewelry, but I also became aware of a lot of stories in which a woman's identity was in some ways linked to jewelry, and then other stories in which her independence was linked to her jewelry. And in order to survive, she could use the jewelry. And then in real life, I've traveled in India. You see these women in Rajasthan working in the fields in the heat, and they're covered with jewelry. They're the bank of their family. That's where the money of the family is, on their bodies. Everything that the family has is on that woman's rings and bracelets and necklaces and so forth. And I realized how important jewelry was for the economy of women. So just things that I noticed in my work and in my travels and in the stories I was working with made me realize that there was a book there.
And perhaps the more bejeweled and bedecked the woman is, the more protective the man is.
Indeed, he's got to take care of her.
She is the bank.
Bank. She's
right. Well, one last question, and there are several questions about what kind of dog is your dog?
My dog is a Cavalier King Charles Spaniel.
Ah.
He is now the King of England. Charles II invented my dog, but he is Charles III. And his name is Raja, which is king. So he is actually King Charles. Perfect. And I'm sorry that he barked. He doesn't usually bark this much, but it's been a very rainy day and he didn't get out enough. So, and there are a lot of coyotes around tonight.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Wendy Doniger, for sharing your knowledge and your enthusiasm tonight. And I want to thank the Friends of the Library once again for supporting this program.
And I want to thank you for inviting me to give a talk. I really enjoyed doing it. It's a nice day.
Thank you. Thank you very much for being here, and watch out for those coyotes.
Thanks.
All right. Good night, everyone. Thank you.